Better or different? We're going to explore the New York Giants offensive line and see where they stand as we get ready for the start of training camp. That's coming up next on the LockedOn Giants podcast.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily New York Giants podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, New York Giant fans, and welcome to another edition of the Locked On Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast family, your team every day. My name is Patricia Traina. Happy to have you with us as we get to the end of the week. We are getting so close to training camp. The Giants rookies report to training camp on the 19th. That's just literally a stone's throw away. And then the following week, the Giants veterans report, and we get things started. And to get you ready for Giants training camp, we're previewing the different position groups. And on today's show, we're going to talk about the New York Giants offensive line, better or different. And this is a question really that we have been asking about this offensive line now for, I want to say the last, 5 years or so, because it just seems like every year there's been a different offensive line, starting offensive line unit. And we have come to learn that the line wasn't better. It was just different. And is this year going to be different? Well, time will tell, but we're going to kind of explore why the signs are pointing in the right direction, why the arrow is pointing in the right direction. And we're also going to take a look at how they kind of got to this situation and why this is all so important. So again, happy to have you with us. Thank you for making us your first listen of the day, or if watching on YouTube, your first watch of the day. Let's get into the nitty gritty here. All right. How did we get to this situation with the offensive line? Well, quite frankly, it's a recurring theme for the Giants and has been for several years. The draft picks have not panned out. All right. So what happens when the draft picks don't pan out? Well, if the draft picks don't pan out, then you got to go out into free agency and you got to spend. And there are very, very few free agents that come in and are worth the money that they get. We have seen it many, many times. So you can go back and you can look at, for example, Eric Flowers, who the Giants drafted as a top 10 pick, thought that he would be their franchise left tackle for years to come. And what happened? Didn't pan out. So they had to go out and they had to sign a Nate Solder to fill that role. And they overspent for Nate Solder, didn't get their money's worth because Solder was starting to decline in his career. That has been a big problem for the Giants, just not picking the right players in the draft and not getting the most out of them. And speaking of which, coaching has been an issue. All right. Coaching, you look more recently at the Giants coaching situation at offensive line. What have we had? Well, with Joe Judge, he had Mark Colombo. Then he brought in Googs to replace Colombo after he was fired. Then the following year, it was Rob Sale and Pat Flaherty. That's a lot of position coaches. That's a lot of cooks in the kitchen. So for this offensive line, for any offensive line, to establish any type of continuity or consistency, when you have different coaches in your ear, wanting you to do different techniques a different way, that can set you back. And that was a problem with the Giants, just not getting the coaching right. And you can also go back and say, okay, well, how good of a job did the coaches do with developing some of the younger talent that they have? I mean, the draft is part of the problem, yes, but how much was coaching and not getting the most out of the guys part of the problem? And then again, I'm going to point to Eric Flowers. The Giants thought he was their left tackle, didn't work out. They tried him at right tackle, didn't work out. What happens? He goes down to, I think it was Jacksonville, and then he went to Washington, got moved inside to guard. And hey, all of a sudden, Eric Flowers was a legitimate and decent player. Now, part of the job of a coach, obviously, is to be able to determine that, right? You can't fit a square peg into a round hole. And this has been the story of this franchise for the last several years. You just can't do that. You have to be flexible and you have to do your homework. And I just felt like the Giants were so determined, to make Eric Flowers their franchise left tackle, a pick that they reached for, by the way, in my opinion, that it just didn't work out. And this has been what has happened with the Giants offensive line since then. You look at Will Hernandez, who didn't work out for this team. As a rookie, Will Hernandez was pretty good. And there were actually whispers that he had Pro Bowl potential. And he started to decline with his second season and then third season, and he slid downhill. Part of it was coaching. Part of it, obviously, is the player. All right. The player, I always thought Will Hernandez, for what it was worth, I always thought he was a little too bulky. And it's interesting because he did slim down last year. Not that it helped, but when you get too bulky, sometimes that affects your mobility and your quickness. And I thought that kind of factored into his stall development. So you have all that, and basically your offensive line goes down the tubes. The final thing I want to mention regarding the offensive line and how we got here is that the offensive line, you have to have players in reserve. You can't leave your cupboard bare. And one of the things the Giants did last year, which I totally don't get to this day, they wanted to roll with the young players. And instead of having additional young players in the pipeline to develop, they brought in mostly veterans to be the backups. Well, those veterans were brought in on one-year deals. And as it turned out, they had a couple guys retire. So, offensive line, you've got to have young talent in the pipeline. Even if you have young talent starting, you want to have young guys that you are able to develop. And I just don't think the Giants did a good job of that last year. It left the cupboard bare, and it basically put the offensive line unit back to square zero with this year. I mentioned coaching. And for what it's worth, Rob Sale, who was the offensive line coach last year, the primary offensive line coach, in retrospect, maybe not the best fit. He was primarily a college coach all his career, came to the Giants. The Giants was his first NFL job. And there's just something to be said for coaching college offensive linemen and coaching NFL offensive linemen. And I just I never got the impression that Sale connected with some of the veterans on the team, and just, there was a disconnect there. And I think had Joe Judge survived, and had Rob Sale even not gotten, the new job that he got, I think he's offensive coordinator in his school down in Florida. I don't think he would have survived as offensive line coach. I really don't. So where does that leave the Giants moving forward? Well, in the next segment, we're going to talk about what to watch, the improvements that have been made, and still to come, why I think the offensive line is finally going to be better as opposed to different. So that's all coming up. Stick around. We'll be right back. All right, Giant fans, we have more coming up on today's LockedOn Giants podcast. But first, if you're living paycheck to paycheck or struggling to make ends meet, it can be really stressful when unexpected expenses come up. Well, now Dave can help you get the most out of your finances and help you out of a pinch when you really need it. Dave is the banking app that can help you get up to $500 instantly with extra cash. That's more money to fill up your tank, buy a gift, or catch up on your bills. There's no interest and no credit check needed. Millions of people have already downloaded the Dave app to get the financial relief they need with extra cash. So if you're in a pinch today and need some extra help, go on and download the Dave app. That's DAV like Victor, E, from the App Store. Sign up for an extra cash account and get up to $500 instantly. Future you will thank you. Terms and conditions apply. Instant transfer fees apply. Visit dave.com/legal for complete information. Banking provided by Evolve, member FDIC. All right, Giant fans, welcome back to the LockedOn Giants podcast. I'm Patricia Traina. We are talking Giants offensive line as we get you ready for training camp, which will be here in a blink of an eye. That's right, a blink of an eye. Boy, the time really flies when you are having fun. And I've enjoyed the time off, the lesser workload, but I am refreshed, ready to go, ready to bring you updates from camp, both here on Locked On Giants and over on Giants Country. It's going to be a great one. And I'm really excited. And I hope you are as well to get things started. So anyway, we are talking offensive line. And the question is, are they better or are they different? So let's take a look at what they've done, how they have set things up to potentially be better, and where things kind of stand at as of this moment. Now, disclaimer, obviously you can't tell with an offensive line unless you see them in pads. And in the springtime, there's no contact, there's no pads. So you can't really tell how physical a unit's going to be. You can't really tell what kind of chemistry they have. The only thing you can kind of tell if you want is you can kind of look for signs of the offensive line being able to communicate both verbally and non-verbally. And even then, in the spring, Andrew Thomas wasn't able to play or practice, I should say, because of, his ankle injury, which was healing and is healed, by the way. So you couldn't really tell, but you could look at, the different combinations that they ran and get a feel for, maybe what they were going to do with the offensive line. So let's start with the obvious. And I think the offensive tackle position for the Giants is probably the strongest it's been in quite some time. Andrew Thomas at left tackle and Evan Neal at right tackle. These are two big guys, and they are very good at protecting the edge. Andrew Thomas last year had a really strong season, I think he allowed something like 18 pressures total, which was a vast improvement from the 50 some odd pressures he allowed in his rookie season. Evan Neal is a big man. Now, is he a polished product? No, he's got to obviously, work on some technique and do a few things and get up to speed at the NFL level, but he's making progress. And, in the drills that they did for the offensive linemen, you saw him play with good pad level. You saw him, hit his strike his mark with his hands. There's some things he needs to work on, and he will during the summer. But who out there doesn't feel good about Evan Neal? I know I do. And considering the Giants have had kind of a revolving door at right tackle, they finally, I think, have their right tackle for the long-term future and their left tackle. So they are in good shape, barring injury, of course, with their offensive tackle position. Now, let's talk about the interior of the offensive line, because this is interesting what the Giants did. They had brought in John Feliciano on a one-year deal to be the center, which is a move that I don't hate, by the way. I know Feliciano was primarily a guard in Buffalo, but I don't hate this move because Feliciano obviously, played in Brian Dable's system up in Buffalo. He's going to be familiar with the terminology, the concepts, all the little intricacies that another center could learn. But, when you want the offense to start playing quickly, it helps to have a guy in the middle to orchestrate all of it who's familiar with what you're doing. This way, the faster that they could play, the faster that they could get that offense up and running to where they're not thinking as much as they ordinarily would. That's a plus. So I don't hate the move of Feliciano at center. The guard situation. You've got Mark Lewinsky. He's going to be the right guard. He's the only one of the offensive linemen who got a multi-year contract. He's going to be here I think his contract's for 3 years, but it's probably in retrospect a 2-year deal, given the way the money falls. At left guard, it looks like Shane Lemieux is going to be the incumbent, but I expect there to be a competition. You've got Max Garcia, who can compete for that position. Jameel Douglas, I think, is more of a right guard, but I know he can play left guard if need be, but I think he's more suited for the right side. And then you've got some young kids. You've got Josh Rivas. Obviously, you've got the draft picks, Marcus McKeithen, Joshua Ezeudu can play that spot. So I think it's going to be Shane Lemieux at left guard, but it's not. That position's not set in stone. I think they're going to kind of see how it plays out. So that being said, the interior of the offensive line, you have a mixture of veteran experience and maybe one young guy. All right, not too bad, because last year the interior of the offensive line was just the best. They couldn't get any push. It just, a lot of the pressures came up the middle as opposed to on the edges outside on the tackles. So I just think that, you've got guys that are a little better suited for the job at hand, and that is to put up a brick wall for Daniel Jones to function. Now, in the last segment, I mentioned coaching. And I want to point out that in Bobby Johnson, who is the new offensive line coach, they have a guy who, when he was in Buffalo, worked with an offensive line that really, if I'm not mistaken, didn't have a first round pick. I want to say the last couple of years, he worked with second round picks, free agents and whatnot. And he got that line to function like a decent line. So Bobby Johnson is a veteran NFL coach, has a specific way of doing things. And this is kind of important because, like I said, every coach has a different way of teaching and a different way of, having a guy perform a certain task. So to have Bobby Johnson align with Brian Dable, they came from the same coaching tree. I think the communication and the likelihood of, everybody being on the same page is going to be much, much better, as opposed to, have Dable hired another offensive line coach that he had never worked with before. So I think that's an underrated part of this whole picture. So the other thing that I want to mention is the Giants finally have young talent in the pipeline. So you've got to get these guys ready, because injuries are going to happen. I can pretty much tell you they're going to happen. They always do with this team. And if they do happen, you've got to have guys in the pipeline that can step in and do the job. The Giants haven't really had that in the past with the offensive line. They had guys, but they weren't either developed properly or they just couldn't get the job done. I don't think that's going to be a problem this year if there are injuries. So the Giants, in my opinion, they have set themselves up with a better offensive line situation. Now, what's kind of interesting is we talk about continuity of an offensive line. You go back to 2007, that offensive line played together for, I think, through the 2010 season, that great offensive line. That's rare nowadays in the NFL. You just don't see offensive lines staying together. But, and this year, by the way, is not going to be an exception, because, Feliciano's on a 1-year deal, Jamil Douglas, Max Garcia, they're on a 1-year deal. But you've got to start someplace. All right. And I think if there's one concern I have about this offensive line, and it's something that they can address next offseason, it's, if need be, is that they don't have a true center on the team. Like I said, Feliciano is a guard. If Nick Gates plays this year, and that's a big if, he's technically, he was a college tackle whose best position I still say is at guard. So they don't really have a true center, a guy who's played it at college, on a consistent basis. That's going to be a need I think the Giants will address next year. You can't fill all the needs in one offseason. So I'm not too concerned about that now. I do think they have guys that if they need to back up Feliciano, that they have guys that could do it. Garcia, Douglas can do it. Ben Bredesen can do it if called upon and he makes the roster. So they do have options. But down the line, I'd like to see them get a legitimate center, a guy who has done it in college at a high enough level. But that's still to come, obviously. Okay, coming up, I'm going to answer the question, better or different, in the next segment. So stick around. We'll be right back. Welcome back, Giant fans, to the LockedOn Giants podcast. I'm Patricia Traina. Happy to have you with us as we get you ready for the start of New York Giants training camp. I'm ready, folks. You can't see it behind me, but I have my backpack is all set up. I have fresh pens, brand new notepads because I go through these things like crazy, especially during the off season. I've got new tape recorder. I've got everything I need to bring you the best possible coverage of the New York Giants training camp. And I can't wait to do it. And I hope you will tune in to the coverage, not just here on the LockedOn Giants podcast, but over on Giants Country, where I do my writing. So, all right, we are talking Giants offensive line. And here's the big $1 million question. Is the line better or different? The last several years, it's been different, not necessarily better. This year, well, obviously, we're going to need to see them play to make a final judgment call. But here's why I think the Giants are going to be better as opposed to different as they were the last several years. All right, I'm going to give you a few reasons. Number one, the youth. Now, sometimes with young players, people are like, well, you don't know what you're going to get. You know, they were studs in college, but are they necessarily going to be studs at the NFL level? I think the Giants got the right tackle spot right with Evan Neal. So you've got Neal, you've got Andrew Thomas in his third season. That's a good young pair of bookends. And, you know, the promise of those two guys, I mean, right then and there, that's an upgrade, in my opinion. That's probably the best young set of tackles they've had in a long time. All right, let's talk about the interior. I mentioned that they have mostly veterans, you know, the veteran center and John Feliciano, who was familiar with Brian Dable's system. Mark Lewinsky, who has worked before with Bobby Johnson, right? And then they have Shane Lemieux, who's the incumbent at left guard, but they also have some other veterans that they can plug in there, as well as some young guys. So they have options. You know, in the past, I don't think we could say that the Giants offensive line has had a whole lot of options, because let's face it, if they had options last year, don't you think maybe they would have made a change at left guard when they saw the guy struggling? Or maybe they would have swapped out a center if they had viable options. Well, this year, the Giants have options. So if somebody gets hurt or somebody underperforms, they can make a change and, you know, be no worse for moving forward. So that's something that gives me hope. The presence, like I said, of Bobby Johnson, who knows what Brian Dable's system is all about, how he wants things coached, how he wants things taught. That's an underrated but very important aspect that gives me hope that things are going to be better. And, you know, just in hearing from the offensive linemen and watching them in the spring, and again, there's no padded practices. You can't really gauge in the springtime just how physical these guys are going to be, but you just get a different type of vibe listening to them. You know, the offensive line, look, everybody knows that the Giants offensive line of the last few years has just not been very good. These guys coming in, they weren't here. They weren't a part of that disaster, but they've heard about it, believe me, because, you know, it's been brought up many times that the offensive line has been an Achilles heel for this team. Trust me when I say this group does not want to be an Achilles heel. They want to be dominating, and they're going to get a good test, by the way, from that Giants defensive front with Wink Martindale running it. And Wink's not going to go easy on those guys. So that is going to tell us a lot when we start to see the offense versus the defense in training camp, when they put the pads on and they start hitting each other. That's going to tell us a lot and give us a good idea as to whether or not this team, this offensive line, is going to be better. I think it will be. I'm optimistic, which I always am. But, you know, I'm also trying to be realistic and look at the clues, look at the signs. And I think this year you look at the offensive line and there's just a lot more to be encouraged by than maybe there was last year when you had some question marks about how the young guys were going to function, how the shakeup was going to work. You know, they moved different guys around. They had three new guys at different positions. I feel better about this version of the offensive line. Now, the one thing that could potentially derail this, obviously, is massive injuries. And I'm not just talking to the starters, but I'm talking to the depth. We have seen that happen. Injuries is not something we can predict, but I do feel confident that if injuries should strike any of the starters, that Bobby Johnson will have the guys in reserve ready to go. We're going to find out. I mean, look, we could talk about Daniel Jones all we want. We could talk about Saquon Barkley all we want. But the bottom line, folks, is that if the offensive line is garbage, it ain't going to matter. We're going to have another, long season if that offensive line doesn't perform. I think it will. We'll see. We'll find out in just a few weeks. And I'll make sure to bring you all the updates. Like I said, I promise I will bring you the updates here on the LockedOn Giants podcast and over on Giants Country. All right, folks, that's going to do it for us here on the LockedOn Giants podcast. Again, thank you for making us your first listen of the day, or watching on YouTube, your first watch of the day. Make sure you keep it here as we run down each position group of the New York Giants, getting you ready for the start of training camp. And again, the rookies report on the 19th. I'm not sure what kind of media avail there's going to be on that day. I don't think there's going to be anything, but if there is, obviously, I'll make sure I bring that to you. So keep it here on the LockedOn Giants podcast. Don't forget to check me out over on Giants Country, and I will see y'all tomorrow.